Hello and welcome to episode 83 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We are here today with David Moon, delegate of District 20 in Montgomery County, Maryland. David, how are you?
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. The first question I'd like to ask you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
So I'm currently serving in the Maryland House of Delegates, and I represent Takoma Park and Silver Spring in Montgomery County. That's widely regarded as probably the most liberal legislative district in the state, and perhaps on the East Coast. And so I think a lot of the work I've undertaken in the General Assembly, I think, really reflects the grassroots activist streak that runs through the voters in my district. I'm on the House Judiciary Committee, and so a lot of the work we've been focusing on the last 2 years is related to criminal justice reform, and we're really trying to be responsive to the sentiment that maybe the tough-on-crime policies of the past few decades have not actually yielded any positive results. So that's been a huge focus, and part of the goal there, to put this in a broader context, is the U.S. now has the world's largest prison population, more than China, which has billions of residents. And so, when you start to look at how it could be that the land of the free incarcerates so many more people than the rest of the world, you really start to unravel a lot about American culture and politics. There's race discrimination and class disparities and untreated mental health issues. There's substance abuse. There's just tons of deep social problems that really get to why these folks are in prison. But we started asking recently, should they be there? Is this the right move? And so,
why are they there?
Well, you have to understand. So a lot of people think when you're looking at the prison population, you're talking about the worst of the worst. Those are the people that we put in a cage, rapists and murderers and things like that.
Before we go any further, can we define the difference between jail and prison?
Sure. Jail is usually going to be a local detention facility. You might have people there who are awaiting trial, or they're there for very minor offenses.
Isn't the jail, the definition of a jail, a location that incarcerates people between 0 and 364 days? And anything from 365 onwards is a prison?
There you go.
Okay. So we're talking about prisons or jails here?
Both.
Okay.
I'm talking about both. And what you'll find, if you look at Maryland and probably any other state, is that, in fact, the incarcerated population is not the worst of the worst. There are, probably between 50 and 60% of the incarcerated either have an undiagnosed or untreated mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, and oftentimes those overlap. And so, let's be realistic here. I hear plenty of stories about waiting lists for substance abuse treatment centers on places like the Eastern Shore, and waiting lists for mental health facilities. And so those who do not have an easy social network to rely on when bad things are happening, those who might not be well-resourced, and, there are those who are, in fact, committing crimes, but, the reality is, our infrastructure, or lack thereof, on mental health and substance abuse, I think, has a lot to do with how people end up in prison instead of somewhere else.
So a few questions. One, just to be clear, is there anyone in the criminal justice system in Maryland who needs to remain in prison? Is there one person?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Okay, so what you are arguing is that many people in the criminal justice system shouldn't be there.
That is correct. That, in fact, when you're talking about substance abuse, that should be looked at as a public health issue, not something that the law enforcement community should be the frontline workers for.
So you're basically differentiating among different populations within the criminal justice system, saying some ought to be where they are and some oughtn't to be where they are. Now, my question for you is, since you mentioned substance abuse rehabilitation centers. Do you have any sense of the annual cost of putting someone through a rehab center for a year? How many years a typical person might need to recover from an addiction, and then similarly, how many years that person might alternatively spend in a prison, and at what annual cost?
So the cost of incarcerating someone is probably, averages $30,000-$40,000 in Maryland.
For a low, medium, or high security?
That's just the statewide average.
Statewide average is about $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
And for how many years is an average conviction for drug possession charges?
Well, it depends. So on the books, you have a maximum penalty of 4 years incarceration. We just changed this, but so most of the folks there, they were charged under the old regime. So the maximum penalty was up to 4 years in prison for simple possession of anything, except for marijuana now. But every other drug could come with up to 4 years. And so, but there's, look, people on their first offense, they're generally not going to be doing time, and maybe not even for their second offense. What starts to happen, though, is that, when the judges and prosecutors decide not to throw the book at them and put them in jail for a long time, they're usually put on conditions of parole or probation. And this means don't hang out with known gang members, check in with your supervisor once every X days.
And how likely is it that they're able to remain clean?
Well, see, this is the interesting thing. Most of the new prison admissions, I think it might be like a third of the new prison admissions in Maryland are not people who committed new crimes. They are people who violated a term of parole or probation.
Now, are the terms too strict, or are these people... what leads to their recidivism, which for our listeners, recidivism means to return to prison after having already been there?
I wouldn't say that they're too strict, actually. I mean, in fact, if someone has a substance abuse issue, we might want to know if they're continuing to use substances. We want them to be looking for a job. We want them to check in with the supervisor. What is too strict is the idea that if they break these terms, we will be sending them back into prison. I mean, we had a case of one gentleman who, from Baltimore City, he had a drug dealing charge from many, many years ago and was now out under terms of probation. And he turned up with a marijuana possession charge, and the judge reinstated a 20-year prison sentence on this gentleman. I mean, that's the kind of insanity, I think, where it's really difficult to see what possible policy outcome or good to the world we are creating with that sort of mindset.
Is there a link to poverty and this recidivism?
So actually, this last year, the Pew Foundation funded a 1-year study of Maryland's sentencing structure, prison system, everything. They did a top-to-bottom look, and they worked with lawmakers, the governor's office, law enforcement officials, public defenders, civil liberties advocates. It was a very methodical study. And what we found is that the prison terms associated with some of these nonviolent drug offenses actually increased the likelihood that someone would engage in recidivism and end up back in the system.
So you're saying that if they hadn't gone to prison, they would have less of a chance of engaging in behaviors in the future that would lead them back to prison?
That's right. And part of the reason is, prison's not really the place you're going to get substance abuse treatment. It's not really the place you're going to go to get mental health treatment.
And you didn't say, what was the annual average cost of substance abuse treatment?
Oh, well, that I don't know. But what I will tell you
Would you say it's less than $40,000 a year?
Sure. And part of the reason is you're not going to be continuously housed in some treatment center the way you would be if you were in prison.
Oh, so you show up.
That's an ongoing. Well, it depends. There's different models, and so there's not one size fits all. Some people are going to lapse and take longer years, maybe.
But let's say you didn't care about the welfare of Marylanders, and let's say you didn't care about the welfare of the incarcerated individuals. And in this hypothetical situation, let's say there was only one thing you cared about, and that was making sure that taxpayers of Maryland got the greatest return for their dollar and spent the least amount on criminal justice possible. Would you say it would be cheaper to send nonviolent drug offenders to drug rehab for a few years, or those same individuals to prison for more years? It sounds like the former, and that it would be more cost effective, regardless of the effect on the individual or how much you might care about them, and regardless of any compassion you might have, it may be less expensive to send them for 2 years to drug rehab than 4 years to prison, which is more expensive every year anyway. Is that true?
In fact, that is one of the key reasons why we now have a lot of right-wing support for criminal justice reforms. We come at this from different perspectives. I look at incarceration as a civil liberties, evidence-based policy-making sort of frame, but the right has been looking at this from a taxpayer accountability sort of frame. And in fact, they are the first, they have been among the first and loudest to argue that this sort of rampant spending on the prison system, when there's no evidence to show that has put a dent in substance abuse, that is actually a good use of tax dollars. Mm-hmm. And so as we scrubbed down our criminal code this year, we are anticipating millions and millions of dollars saved, and we're going to divert those funds that used to go to prison. Over time, they're going to slowly be shifted into reentry services and substance abuse treatment and other things that have a much clearer link to success in this world. And part of the reason, just so people understand why it is that prison can be such an ineffective tool for people who have issues, is that, when you come out of prison, for years we haven't really cared what happens to people upon release. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing is that not only do they have, terms of parole and probation that they have to stick to that could land them back, but their criminal record itself, even for a petty nonviolent offense, would render them unable to be employed anywhere, because what employer would want to hire someone with a known record? And
so if they can't find employment, then they have no means of feeding themselves, medicating themselves, and that the only thing that they know how to do in order to survive is to return to crime. So you're saying that there aren't very many good transitional employment programs or halfway programs for individuals leaving prison, which leads me to my next question, which is, do you have any so there's a certain program out there which is bringing education, especially higher education, into the criminal justice system. You have individuals receiving high school and college and advanced degrees in prison. Then when they leave, I've heard that recidivism rates are lower than 10% for that population, meaning if they are well educated in prison, then they have job skills that they actually can use to find their way and avoid going back to prison. Can you speak on that and talk about potentially any benefits to taxpayers that may result from that program?
That's right. I mean, a lot of times the sort of rhetoric we would hear about doing anything that might be in the benefit of people incarcerated, they would always say, well, why are we rewarding them for their criminal behavior? And again, if you want to take this from a strict cost-benefit analysis to tax dollars, like, we're not rewarding them, we're rewarding ourselves. Because, in fact, this is a cost savings in the long run to not have someone who has no economic opportunity when they are released, and basically all the incentives are pulling them back towards a life of crime.
Do you have any sense of how expensive a college education course might be for an inmate in prison?
That I do not know.
Would you say it's more or less than $40,000 a year?
Oh, it's got to be less than $40,000.
It's got to be less because state tuition at a university is less than that, right?
That's right.
So if you're thinking about adding college tuition for a few years in prison, and your return is that they don't come back for another 5 or 10 years for an offense at a cost of $40,000 a year, but instead are able to be productive tax-paying members of society, then you might quite rapidly realize a return on your investment in education in the criminal justice system without ever having any concern for the welfare of the prisoner, but only saying we don't want to pay to incarcerate him again. Is that true?
That is 100% correct.
So let's talk a little bit about David Moon.
Okay,
Are you an attorney?
I am.
And why is it that you were placed by Speaker Michael Bush of the House of Delegates on the Judiciary Committee 2 years ago when you first entered the House of Delegates?
I actually requested to be put on the Judiciary Committee. Part of the way I think about policy advocacy is I like to work on issues that are timely, ripe, and at a point in their evolution where they can actually have an opportunity to pass. And so, if you look back on my...
For our listeners, when Delegate Moon refers to a piece of legislation passing, what he means is it has passed on through a vote in both the House and the Senate and has been signed into law by the governor, or has passed into law without his signature. But what he's talking about is taking a piece of proposed law, which is called a bill, and turning it into actual law. That is what he refers to when he says passing. Okay?
That's right. And basically, I don't like to waste my time. So if it doesn't look like something's passing, I'm probably not going to spend too much time
But how many years
over it.
does it often take for a piece of legislation to become law?
Well, you can suss those things out. You do have to lay the ground. Like right now, I'm beginning to lay the groundwork for a universal child care push. Mm-hmm. That's going to take many, many years. But there are little pieces of it you can put in place beforehand. Like,
do you have an example?
Yeah, I'm trying to get incentivized creation of more child care centers, just broadly, because...
And would that go through the Judiciary Committee?
No. This is a county delegation bill.
So you have an interest in pushing forth a piece of legislation that will not pass through your committee. Is that common?
Well, actually, so most of the bills I've passed did not go through my committee.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's, we tend to work on bills on our committee primarily, and I had, the largest number of bills were obviously on the Judiciary Committee where I serve. But, sometimes you'll identify a hole in public policy or a gap where something could be done, and if no one else is working on it, then, or wants to work on it, then, oftentimes we will introduce legislation in committees we're not on.
So talk a little bit more about childcare. You said that you are interested in working on pieces of legislation that have a likelihood of passing. Of course, as Jamie Raskin often says, who's a former colleague of yours, he has often said, I don't want to be in the political center, I want to be in the moral center, and he references how marriage equality was perceived as having no chance of passing a number of years ago, and of course it's law across the nation now. And there are many things in history that had purportedly no chance of passing that later became law. So how do you assess if something is likely to become passed in the future, and if it has no chance, how do you stack that up against previous pieces of legislation that supposedly had no chance and later passed?
Well, look, we had campaign finance reform happen in Congress nationally twice in the last 100 years. Once during Richard Nixon and once during the financial scandals that happened under the George W. Bush administration. All along the way, you had to have advocates sitting there pushing for a campaign finance reform, common cause, gutting it out year after year, but understanding that it only happened twice. And, you have to be able to assess your odds, I think, in that manner. But the reason you do that sort of laying the groundwork is that when you do have a major scandal that creates a moment where politicians feel they must respond to the public pressure on something, then you have to be ready and ram it through.
So luck favors the prepared.
That is, I would say 100% that you have to have some basis for it. If you get caught off guard and you're not ready when a moment emerges, then you've really missed an opportunity. I mean, that's certainly the case with criminal justice reform now, where the pendulum has finally swung back after 4.5 decades of this rampant drug war and ramp up in our prison population. And I've been telling all my colleagues, this is our moment. We have to get as many of these reforms in right now before the pendulum might swing in another direction down the road.
How did you ever first become aware of and interested in criminal justice reform, the war on drugs, and its intersection with mental health care and substance abuse?
Well, my path down criminal justice reform started with probably the most obvious issue you could think about, and that's the death penalty. When I was in college, I interned at the ACLU, and
For our listeners, what does that mean?
the American Civil Liberties Union.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the projects I was working on was death penalty abolition at the time. And so this was really my first window into the idea that there might be something wrong with our criminal justice system. And, for me, just the concept that the government would assert its right to kill people was, morally problematic. And, that led me to start working down the road with the Innocence Project. And the Innocence Project is an organization that once DNA testing became widespread in the legal community, they would go and investigate claims of innocence by people who were incarcerated and go back, investigate the cases, and try to find biological material that could be tested. And as we've seen now, there have been hundreds of people released from prison now who were wrongfully incarcerated and in fact were innocent. The very first case was in Maryland. It was this gentleman,
Bloodsworth.
Kirk Bloodsworth was one of the first exonerees using this DNA evidence, and he was actually on death row at one point in time. So you can see the segue here. Not only did I start with a moral problem with the death penalty, but my work on the Innocence Project was really showing me that, in fact, our system was highly flawed, sometimes leading to people being put on death row who were innocent, and how could we, as a society, turn our eye to these kinds of problems?
So you felt a sort of moral outrage at what you felt was injustice being committed in your name, through having first worked as an intern for the ACLU and then having gotten involved in the Innocence Project. Is that a fair recapitulation of your path to advocating for criminal justice reform?
I think that's right, but the key here, I think, too, is that as I learned more and more about these cases where someone had been wrongly incarcerated, lots of things come out when you read these cases. Prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, tampering with the evidence, fabricating evidence, not disclosing evidence to the defense, rigging a photo lineup in such a way that it's pointing unfairly at the person who was wrongly incarcerated. It's just on and on and on. The lack of resources available to public defenders. And it really started to make me have this bigger sense that there was many imperfections in the criminal justice system.
Interesting. And so now you're a delegate, and you're actually taking action. And you're doing so representing District 20. Now, would you say that criminal justice is an issue that matters a lot to the constituents of District 20, or is it one that is driven mostly by your own conscience?
I would say it impacts the residents of District 20 and the state in many ways, so whether they know it or not, they are supportive. And I'll give you an example. We spend more money on our incarceration in Maryland than we do on every single community college and state college combined. So it is literally the case that we're funding jails, not schools, in Maryland.
And how do your constituents feel about that?
I think most people would be alarmed when they hear this statistic.
And when you frame it in those terms to your constituents, do you feel as though they support your work?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, this is one of these issues. Like, if you were to ask people 2 years ago when I ran for office, what was at the top of their mind in terms of problems in Maryland, I don't think the first thing out of their mouth is going to be our prison population. But when I go and talk to them at the doors and through e-communications, in fact, they were quite sympathetic once I explained what the problem was and what I was trying to do. I think today, fast forward to the present, there is a much larger understanding that these are issues, and I think it's been heavily driven by the police brutality issue taking prominence, the Black Lives Matter protests, and they've really elevated not just police brutality, but all of the underlying injustices in our criminal justice system.
So we're approaching the end of our podcast, and I'd like to ask you a final question, which is to reflect upon your lifetime of public service, not only as a delegate, but as an activist, as a journalist, as an attorney. I'd like to ask you to think about all the things that you've done to make the world a better place, and take a moment and share with our listeners why it is that you've done this. What drives you each and every morning, and how has that evolved over the course of your life to date?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I've been fairly consistently obsessed with pursuing projects that advance social and economic justice. When I was in college and high school, I did a lot of activism, and that never ended. And pretty much every summer when I was looking for internships, I would intentionally choose a different subject matter so that I would be grounded and knowledgeable about a range of things. I worked on women's rights at some points in time. I worked on voting rights at other points in time, criminal justice reform, and so on. And that's really been my passion. I mean, in the 90s, when I was in college and I was interning at the ACLU, I remember telling my supervisor that if Maryland would pass death penalty repeal, marriage equality, that those were such impossible or improbable things that I could retire as an advocate and feel satisfied that lots had gotten done.
Have you kept in touch with him?
Yes.
Is he still working?
She. No, she retired actually.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Pigs do fly.
Yeah. But it's amazing. I mean, and I'm really proud to have worked on or managed campaigns for a lot of the key people that were responsible for those victories, and my work with the groups that helped those over the finish line. And I actually never thought I would actually get to play a part in things like that. Really? You never thought you would get elected? I thought it was, Montgomery County only emerged as a majority-minority community in the last few years, and I had... For our listeners who can't see you, how is that relevant to you? So I'm Asian American, and growing up, you don't really see any Asian Americans in politics, and so I had always had the sense that in America, if you wanted to succeed politically, you would have a huge advantage if you were black or white, since there were much larger populations of those communities in places like Montgomery County. And that started to change once I saw other candidates run and win who were from very diverse backgrounds. So that has been Delegate David Moon of District 20 in Montgomery County, Maryland, who speaks about a lifetime passion that has spanned decades of commitment as an advocate to issues across the spectrum, from criminal justice to women's issues, from the ending the war on drugs to ending the death penalty and advancing marriage equality. David Moon has long been an advocate and has found fulfillment in his work in advancing the most progressive issues of our time, and in representing one of the most progressive districts in the East Coast. He's able to take his lifetime of advocacy to the next level as an elected official. So, David, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for having me. And this has been episode 83 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.